On March 9, 1919, Frederick Gilbert Bourne died at his 100-room estate on Long Island. He left behind an empire worth $43 million. He also left behind a castle on a private island that few Americans knew existed. 28 rooms, secret passages accessible through hidden panels, a dungeon carved into bedrock, a 5-story clock tower with Westminster chimes sounding every 15 minutes. Built between 1903 and 1905 at a cost of $500,000. The castle sat on Dark Island in the St. Lawrence River, just yards from the Canadian border. Bourne had called it the Towers. He claimed it was a hunting lodge, though the 7-acre island was far too small for hunting. Bourne was the 5th president of the Singer Sewing Machine Company. He had transformed it into perhaps the first modern multinational corporation. He employed tens of thousands of workers across 3 continents. Those workers struck in 1911. 11,000 of them walked off the job in the largest sewing machine workers' strike in history. They earned 14 to 16 shillings per week, while polishing wood in Scottish factories. Bourne earned millions. Some called him a business genius, who revolutionized consumer credit. Others saw exploitation dressed in innovation. The castle represented industrial wealth at its peak. But Dark Island carried secrets in its passages and a religious fraud that lasted decades. If you are fascinated by Gilded Age estates built on worker suffering and the dark histories historic sites don't tell, subscribe. Tell me in the comments which robber baron castle we should investigate next. Now, let's discover how a sewing machine fortune built a kingdom of secrets on an island named for shadows. Chapter 1. The Clerk Who Became a Commodore. Frederick Gilbert Bourne was born on December 20th, 1851 in Boston, Massachusetts. His father was Reverend George Washington Bourne. His mother was Harriet Gilbert Bourne. The family had no fortune. The Bournes moved to New York City when Frederick was around 9 years old. His father preached. His mother managed the household. Young Frederick understood early that wealth would not arrive through inheritance. He was 14 years old when he started working. The year was 1865, and the Civil War had just ended. He took a job with the Atlantic Submarine Wrecking Company. The work taught him nothing about sewing machines, but everything about how men with ambition navigated industrial America. By his late teens, Bourne had moved to the Mercantile Library of New York. He worked as a clerk. He also sang. Music became his entry point into circles far above his station. The Mendelssohn Glee Club attracted amateur singers from New York's business elite. Bourne joined and discovered he had a voice that impressed people who mattered. One of those people was Alfred Corning Clark. Clark was the son of Edward Cabot Clark. Edward Clark had co-founded the Singer Sewing Machine Company alongside Isaac Merritt Singer in 1851, the same year Bourne was born. By the time Bourne met Alfred Clark in the late 1870s, the Clark family controlled Singer and owned valuable Manhattan real estate. Alfred Clark took an interest in the young clerk who sang so well. They developed what later accounts would describe carefully as a close personal relationship. Clark traveled frequently to Europe, often to Norway, where he visited a male companion named Lorentz Severin Skagard. Clark was married to Elizabeth Scriven, but his time abroad suggested other priorities. In 1880, Clark offered Bourne a position. The Clark family was constructing an enormous apartment building on West 72nd Street along Central Park. They needed someone to manage construction. Bourne accepted. The Dakota apartment building would become one of Manhattan's most prestigious addresses. Bourne oversaw its completion. He learned how wealth operated at scale. He absorbed the vocabulary of property management, construction, logistics, and financial leverage. While Clark traveled abroad, he sent Bourne to Singer board meetings in his place. Bourne sat in rooms with men who controlled one of America's largest manufacturing companies. He listened. He asked questions. He made himself indispensable. In 1882, Edward Cabot Clark died. Alfred Clark inherited his father's estate. He appointed Bourne to manage it. For a man born to a reverend's family with no connections, this represented extraordinary advancement. Bourne was 30 years old and managing millions. The position gave him proximity to Singer's operations. He studied how the company manufactured machines. He understood the distribution networks. He recognized inefficiencies that decades of success had allowed to calcify. In 1889, Alfred Clark and the Singer board made a decision that would transform American consumer culture. They appointed Frederick Gilbert Bourne president of the Singer Manufacturing Company. He was 36 years old. What Bourne understood that others had missed was simple. Singer manufactured excellent sewing machines, but the $125 price tag excluded most American families. Cash purchases limited the market to the wealthy. Credit was considered disreputable, associated with debt traps and financial irresponsibility. Bourne created the installment plan. For $5 down and $3 per month, a family could own a Singer sewing machine. The innovation seems obvious in retrospect. In 1889, it was revolutionary. Bourne had invented consumer credit as Americans would come to know it. Sales exploded. By 1900, Singer was selling hundreds of thousands of machines annually. The installment plan allowed families to buy tools they could not otherwise afford. It also locked those families into monthly payments that generated steady revenue for Singer. Bourne did not stop with American sales. He recognized that sewing machines required no translation. A woman in Germany or Scotland or Russia needed the same product as a woman in New York. Manufacturing could be distributed globally to reduce shipping costs and tariffs. Under Bourne's leadership, Singer built factories across 3 continents. The Clydebank facility in Scotland opened in 1884 before Bourne became president. By 1900, it employed approximately 7,000 workers in a complex covering nearly 1 million square feet. The factory produced 13,000 sewing machines per week, making it the largest sewing machine factory in the world. Singer also operated facilities in Elizabethport, New Jersey, South Bend, Indiana, Wittenberg, Germany, Floridsdorf, Austria, Podolsk, Russia, Moscow. Each factory followed the same model. Interchangeable parts manufactured with precision tools. Assembly lines that reduced dependence on skilled craftsmen. Wages kept low through labor surplus. Production maximized through what management called scientific efficiency. The workers called it something else. By 1905, Bourne had served as Singer president for 16 years. He had transformed the company into what business historians would later describe as perhaps the first modern multinational industrial enterprise of any nationality. He had pioneered consumer credit. He had built a vertically integrated manufacturing empire spanning multiple countries. He had also accumulated personal wealth that exceeded most men's imagination. Exact figures from that era remain unclear, but when Bourne died in 1919, his estate was valued at $43 million. Most of that fortune had accumulated during his presidency. In 1905, at age 53, Bourne retired from active management. He remained a company director, but daily operations passed to his successor, Douglas Alexander. Alexander would serve as president for the next 44 years and would eventually receive a baronetcy in the 1921 birthday honors for his services to the welfare of industrial workers. The contrast between Alexander's later recognition and Bourne's tenure was notable. Bourne received no honors for worker welfare. His legacy was profit, expansion, and the installment plan that made consumer debt acceptable in American culture. He had other interests by 1905. He had been elected Commodore of the New York Yacht Club in 1903. He belonged to the Jekyll Island Club in Georgia, known informally as the Millionaires Club. He owned multiple properties, including a 1,000-acre estate at Oakdale, Long Island, with a 100-room mansion called Indian Neck Hall. He maintained an apartment at the Dakota, the building whose construction had launched his ascent. And he owned a 7-acre island in the St. Lawrence River where he was building something that had nothing to do with sewing machines. While Bourne accumulated yachts and estates and club memberships, the workers who built his fortune accumulated grievances. The factories ran on labor that earned shillings while management earned fortunes. The system worked perfectly for the men at the top. It would not work perfectly forever. Chapter 2. The Strike of 11,000. In February 1911, 12 women in a Glasgow factory refused additional work without additional pay. Within weeks, 11,000 workers walked off the job. The Clydebank factory sat on the north bank of the River Clyde in Scotland. Singer had opened the facility in 1884 to meet European demand that American factories could not satisfy. By 1911, the complex employed between 7,000 and 16,000 workers depending on production schedules. The facility had grown to cover nearly 1 million square feet. 6-story buildings dominated the skyline. A massive clock tower rose 200 feet, visible for miles, the largest four-sided clock tower in the world. The factory produced an average of 13,000 sewing machines each week, more than any other sewing machine factory on Earth. Inside those buildings, women worked in the wood polishing department. They finished the wooden cabinets that housed Singer's machines. The work required speed and precision. Any defect had to be corrected before the piece moved to the next stage of assembly. The women were paid by piecework. They earned approximately 16 shillings per week if they worked quickly and made few mistakes. A second group of women earned 14 shillings per week to fix defects that the first group missed. On February 21, 1911, management made a change. The higher-paid polishers would now be required to correct their own defects. The work previously done by the 14-shilling women would be added to the responsibilities of the 16-shilling women. No additional wages would be provided for the additional labor. 12 women refused. The dispute seemed minor at first, a small disagreement over work assignments in a single department. Management expected compliance within days. The women were replaceable. The factory employed thousands. Losing 12 polishers would cause barely a ripple in production. Within a month, nearly 11,000 workers had walked off the job. The strike spread from the wood polishing department to the entire factory. What had begun as 12 women objecting to unpaid additional work became a mass uprising against scientific management techniques that squeezed more productivity from workers without increasing compensation. The workers had specific grievances: increased workloads with no wage adjustments, dismissals of experienced workers followed by redistribution of their duties to remaining staff, piecework rates that required impossible speed to earn subsistence wages, conditions that treated human beings as interchangeable components in an assembly process. Management responded with outrage. The Sewing Machine and Cycle Gazette, a trade publication that accepted substantial advertising revenue from Singer, published its assessment of the situation. The report declared the stoppage absolutely unwarranted. 4 girls had objected to a slight alteration of their duties. If properly approached, their employers would have dealt justly with them. A socialist gang had seized the opportunity to serve its own petty ends. The strike committee would not be content until it had Singer under its heels. Socialist agitators would find their presence at Kilbowie unwelcome for years to come. The language revealed management's perspective. This was not a legitimate labor dispute. It was agitation by outside radicals who had manipulated naive young women into rebellion against benevolent employers. The strike lasted for weeks. Production stopped. Orders went unfilled. The financial impact began accumulating. The strike committee organized. They coordinated picket lines. They maintained discipline among thousands of workers. They resisted pressure from management and from publications that characterized them as radicals undermining Scottish industry. Singer management eventually called for a referendum. Workers were asked to vote on returning to work under modified conditions. Despite the strike committee's efforts to block the vote, 6,527 workers responded. The majority agreed to return. The strike ended. The workers went back to their machines. Production resumed. The trade publications declared victory for rational management over socialist agitation. The proper order had been restored. The lesson was clear. Workers who objected to reasonable adjustments to their duties would find sympathy in short supply. The actual significance of the strike would not become clear for years. The 1911 Singer strike was among the first major labor actions to recognize women as workers deserving the same rights and protections as men. The strike predated the labor movement known as Red Clydeside that would convulse Scotland in the years following World War I. It demonstrated that women workers could organize, sustain coordinated action, and extract concessions from one of the world's largest corporations. The BBC would eventually produce a centenary film about the female workers who stood up to American management. Historians would study the strike as a turning point in women's labor rights. But in 1911, the immediate outcome was simpler. The women returned to work. The wages remained 14 to 16 shillings per week. The workloads remained high. The piecework system continued extracting maximum productivity for minimum cost. Frederick Bourne remained president throughout the strike. He had technically retired from day-to-day management in 1905, but he retained his position as a company director. He received reports on the Clydebank situation. He understood the financial impact of the work stoppage. His response, if any, was not recorded in company documents that survive. No public statement addressed the workers' grievances. No adjustment to wages or working conditions appeared in the aftermath. Singer continued operating exactly as it had before. 12 women refused additional unpaid work. The pattern repeated itself across Singer's global operations. The South Bend, Indiana facility experienced strikes in 1902 and 1939. The New Jersey plant saw walkouts in 1949. Every Singer factory eventually faced worker actions, protesting the same core issues: increased productivity demands, stagnant wages, treatment of human labor as a fungible resource. Management consistently characterized these actions as outside agitation rather than legitimate grievances. Workers consistently organized anyway. The cycle continued for decades. Bourne died in 1919, 8 years after the Clydebank strike. His obituary praised his business genius and his innovations in consumer credit. The installment plan had revolutionized American commerce. He had built Singer into a global powerhouse. The obituary made no mention of the women who polished wood for 14 shillings per week while he accumulated $43 million. That omission was not accidental. It was the system documenting itself. Wealth preserved its own story. Labor was mentioned only when it became a problem requiring management. Chapter 3. The Island Called Dark. In 1902, Frederick Bourne purchased a 7-acre island in the St. Lawrence River. The previous owners had called it Bluff Island. Native Americans who fished the surrounding waters had named it Lone Star. Bourne would give it a different name entirely. The island sat near Chippewa Bay in the lower Thousand Islands region. Dense evergreen trees covered most of the land, casting shadows so deep that even on bright afternoons the island appeared darker than its neighbors. The effect was pronounced enough that locals had already begun using an unofficial name: Dark Island. Bourne made it official. The island measured just 7 acres, too small for the hunting parties Bourne would later claim justified its purchase. The St. Lawrence River flowed past on all sides. The shipping channel ran along the south edge, close enough that cargo vessels would pass within 100 feet of any structure built there. The international border between the United States and Canada cut through the river just yards to the north. The location offered isolation without true remoteness. Alexandria Bay, the hub of Thousand Island society, sat roughly 9 miles northeast. The town of Hammond, population 280, was the nearest settlement at 5.5 miles away. Half that distance was water. Wealthy Americans had been building summer estates in the Thousand Islands since the 1870s. George Bolt, proprietor of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, had begun constructing an enormous castle on Hart Island in 1900. Bolt Castle was designed to rival European palaces. 6 stories, 120 rooms, Italian gardens, a powerhouse to generate electricity. Bolt was spending millions. Then, in 1904, his wife Louise died suddenly. Bolt immediately halted construction. He never returned to the island. The unfinished castle stood as a monument to grief, visible to every boat that passed. Bourne began his project while Bolt's tragedy was still fresh. The timing was fortunate for Bourne's construction plans. The workers Bolt had employed on Hart Island needed new jobs. Oak Island, where granite was quarried for castles and mansions, had been preparing for layoffs. Bourne's project saved those positions. He hired Ernest Flagg as architect. Flagg was 46 years old in 1903. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had designed some of the most prominent buildings in New York, including 2 structures for Singer. One was the company's headquarters, a 12-story loft building at Broadway and Prince Street. The other would become more famous. In 1908, Flagg would complete the Singer Building at 149 Broadway. The structure rose 47 stories and 612 feet above Lower Manhattan. For 6 months, it would hold the title of world's tallest building. The Singer Building would stand until 1968, when it would be demolished to make way for One Liberty Plaza, earning the distinction of tallest building ever intentionally destroyed. But in 1903, Flagg was working on something smaller and stranger. Bourne had given him unusual instructions. The island structure should resemble a castle, but it should not imitate any specific existing castle. Flagg should create something original while maintaining the appearance of medieval authenticity. Flagg had recently finished reading Sir Walter Scott's 1826 novel Woodstock. The book described an English castle used as a royal hunting lodge near Oxford during the reign of Charles I. Scott's castle featured turrets, secret passages, and a dungeon. The architectural details were specific enough to guide design without constraining creativity. Flagg used Woodstock as inspiration. The result would be called the Towers, though it would acquire other names over the following century. Construction began in the spring of 1903. Approximately 100 masons were employed at the project's peak. Another 16 workers maintained year-round presence for the full construction period. Bourne imported Italian stonemasons for the detail work. These craftsmen had skills passed down through generations. They could carve granite into elaborate shapes that local workers could not replicate. They shaped the stone into griffins, acanthus leaves, and fantastical creatures that would decorate the castle's exterior. The granite came from Oak Island, quarried and transported by barge during summer months. In winter, workers hauled tons of stone across the frozen St. Lawrence River. Ice thick enough to support loaded sledges formed most winters. The crossing was dangerous, but necessary. Sandstone came from the quarry in Hammond, closer but still requiring water transport. The construction timeline stretched across 3 years, spring 1903 to autumn 1905. The final cost approached $500,000. In current purchasing power, the equivalent exceeds $17 million. The figure covered materials, labor, and the elaborate architectural details that made the towers unlike anything else in the Thousand Islands. Bourne presented the completed castle to his wife Emma and their children in the fall of 1905. He claimed it was a surprise, a vacation retreat he had built without their knowledge. Whether Emma actually remained unaware of a 3-year construction project employing over 100 workers is unclear from surviving family correspondence. The structure rose 4 stories from the island's bedrock. A 5th-story tower climbed higher, topped with a clock mechanism that would be added in 1913. The clock faces measured 6 feet in diameter. Local folklore would later claim they were solid gold. They were not, but the rumor persisted for decades. 28 rooms filled the interior. Bedrooms, bathrooms, a grand drawing room, a library, a kitchen equipped for preparing meals for dozens of guests. 10 fireplaces provided heat. 8 bathrooms offered modern plumbing, a luxury in 1905 even among the wealthy. 3 boat houses served the island. One was large enough to house a 120-foot yacht. Another contained the steam engines and massive generator that powered the entire property. Electric lighting throughout, fed by the island's own power plant. But the most distinctive features were invisible from the water. Secret passages wound through the walls. Hidden panels opened to reveal staircases and corridors connecting distant parts of the castle. A dungeon had been carved into the bedrock below the main structure. The architectural flourishes served no defensive purpose. The Towers was not a fortress. It was theater. Bourne was 54 years old when construction finished. He had spent $500,000 building a hunting lodge on an island too small for hunting. He had imported Italian craftsmen to carve stone into medieval fantasy. He had created secret passages that led nowhere important and a dungeon that would never hold prisoners. The architectural choices revealed something about the man who commissioned them. This was not practical construction. This was spectacle, a stage set where Bourne could perform the role of feudal lord, master of a private domain where his word was absolute. The workers who built it left no record of what they thought about carving griffins into granite for a man who earned millions while their counterparts in Scotland earned shillings. Their silence was not consent. It was erasure. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Walls. The library contained a hidden panel. Pull a specific book from the shelf. The mechanism triggered. The wall opened to reveal a secret passage. This was not defensive architecture. Medieval castles had secret passages to allow escape during sieges or to move supplies without enemy observation. The towers had no enemies. The passages led to other rooms within the same structure. They served no strategic purpose. They were theater. A network of passages wound through the walls, connecting different parts of the castle. Some passages had mechanical opening mechanisms. Others required electrical switches. The Bourne family could move from the drawing room to the upper bedrooms without using the main staircases. Guests could be observed without their knowledge. Entire sections of the castle could be accessed invisibly. The library panel was the most elaborate. A specific volume on a specific shelf had to be pulled at the correct angle. The action released a locking mechanism embedded in the wall. The panel swung open smoothly on hidden hinges. The passage beyond was narrow, lit by small windows cut through the exterior stone. Each passage entrance was hidden or blended into the wall design. Carved wooden panels concealed some. Stone blocks that appeared solid actually pivoted on central axes. Bookcases slid aside. Fireplaces contained false backs that opened to reveal staircases. The castle contained 28 rooms by official count. Bedrooms occupied the upper floors. 8 bathrooms, distributed throughout the structure, offered modern plumbing. The drawing room stretched across a substantial portion of the main floor, large enough to accommodate dozens of guests. The library held Bourne's book collection. The kitchen was equipped to prepare elaborate meals. 10 fireplaces provided heat during the cold months. The massive marble fireplace in the great entrance hall dominated the space. Suits of armor stood guard on either side. The medieval styling continued throughout. Carved stone, heavy wooden beams, iron fixtures designed to resemble torches from centuries past. Below the main structure, accessible through one of the hidden passages, was the dungeon. The space had been carved from bedrock. Stone walls, a low ceiling. Iron rings embedded in the walls suggested chains and prisoners, though none would ever be held there. The dungeon existed purely for atmosphere. Bourne could show guests the dark chamber beneath his castle and watch their reactions. Above everything rose the clock tower, 5 stories tall, visible for miles across the water. 4 clock faces, each measuring 6 feet in diameter, faced the cardinal directions. The mechanism would be installed in 1913, 8 years after the castle's completion. Westminster chimes would sound every 15 minutes, announcing the passage of time to an island where time had no particular importance. Local folklore insisted the clock faces were solid gold. The rumor started early and proved impossible to dispel, despite no evidence supporting it. The clock faces were metal, painted and gilded but not solid precious metal. The legend persisted because it fit the narrative. A man wealthy enough to build such a castle would certainly use solid gold for his clock tower. 3 boathouses served the island's water access needs. The largest could accommodate a 120-foot yacht. Its interior featured polished wood and brass fittings. The second boathouse contained the practical machinery that made the castle habitable: steam engines, a massive generator that supplied electricity to the entire property. The third was smaller, designed for skiffs and rowing boats. A squash court would be added later, in 1928, after Bourne's death. His daughter Marjorie would have it built for her husband's birthday. The traditional rose garden predated the court, planted during the original construction period. The south side of the island faced the shipping channel. Cargo vessels passed close enough that passengers could see details of the castle's exterior. The proximity to commercial traffic undermined any pretense of true isolation. The architectural elements accumulated into a coherent statement. This was a fantasy rendered in granite and carved stone. Every detail reinforced the illusion of medieval authenticity while incorporating modern conveniences that actual medieval castles never possessed: electric lighting, modern plumbing, a power plant, telephone connections to the mainland. Ernest Flagg had created exactly what Bourne requested: a castle that looked ancient but functioned as a modern luxury residence, a stage set where Bourne could perform the role of lord and master. The secret passages allowed surveillance and movement that fed into the theatrical experience. The dungeon provided a frisson of danger without actual risk. The clock tower announced importance to anyone who could see the island. Nothing about the towers served practical purposes beyond housing and entertaining guests. The island was too small for hunting, despite Bourne's stated intention. The secret passages led nowhere that couldn't be reached by normal corridors. The dungeon held no prisoners. The defensive appearance defended against no threats. What the architecture revealed was simpler than the elaborate mechanisms suggested. Bourne wanted a monument to himself. He wanted a private kingdom where his authority was absolute and his wealth was visible in every carved stone and hidden passage. He wanted guests to arrive and understand immediately that they were entering a space unlike anywhere else they had been. The towers succeeded completely in that goal. Visitors who arrived by boat saw the castle rising from the island like something transported from Scotland or England. The granite walls, the turrets, the massive clock tower climbing toward the sky. The overall effect suggested centuries of history that did not exist. Inside, the effect intensified. Suits of armor, carved fireplaces large enough to stand inside, the library with its hidden panel, the drawing room with its medieval styling and modern electric lighting. Every room balanced historical appearance with contemporary comfort. The great entrance hall featured a marble fireplace so large that several people could stand within it simultaneously. The knights in armor flanking it had been purchased from European dealers. They had never protected any medieval lord. They were props in Bourne's theatrical production. The passages allowed Bourne and his family to move through their castle with an illusion of mystery. Pull a book, trigger a mechanism, disappear through a wall. The mechanical complexity served no purpose beyond entertainment. But entertainment was the purpose. Frederick Bourne had built a playground for adults wealthy enough to appreciate elaborate architectural jokes. The secret passages were the joke. So was the dungeon. So was the entire pretense that this was a hunting lodge when the island couldn't support hunting. The castle announced what Bourne had become by 1905. A man so wealthy he could spend $500,000 on a vacation house designed to impress other wealthy people with how wealthy he was. The workers who carved the griffins into granite understood the message. Their names were not recorded because they were not important to the story Bourne was telling. The story was about him. Chapter 5. The Family Summers. Frederick and Emma Bourne had 12 children. 3 died young. 9 survived to summer at Dark Island. Emma Sparks Keeler married Frederick on February 9, 1875. She was 20 years old. He was 23. Emma's grandfather was Commodore Davidson, one of the founders of the New York Yacht Club. The connection brought social legitimacy to a young man whose father was a reverend with no fortune. Their first child, Frederick Gilbert Bourne, Jr., was born in 1876. He died at age 8 in 1884. The second child, Arthur Keeler Bourne, survived. Louisa followed in 1879. George was born in 1881 but died at age 10. May arrived in 1883. Alfred in 1885. George again in 1887, replacing the son who had died. Marjorie in 1890. Kenneth in 1891, who died at age 7 in 1898. Howard Davidson Bourne in 1893. By the time the Towers was completed in 1905, Emma had endured the deaths of 3 children and was raising 9 others. The ages ranged from Arthur at 28 to Howard at 12. The family used the castle several weeks each summer and early fall. They arrived by yacht from New York or by train to the nearest station, then by boat to the island. The summer season in the Thousand Islands typically ran from late June through September. Wealthy families moved between properties following comfortable weather and social obligations. The Bournes maintained multiple residences. Indian Neck Hall in Oakdale, Long Island, sat on nearly 1,000 acres. The mansion contained 100 rooms. Gardens, stables, outbuildings, and waterfront access made it a complete estate. Frederick had purchased the property in the 1890s and expanded it continuously. The estate adjoined the W.K. Vanderbilt property, placing the Bournes among Long Island's most prominent families. In Manhattan, they kept an apartment at the Dakota on West 72nd Street. Frederick had managed construction of the building in 1880. The connection to Alfred Corning Clark and the Clark family ensured the Bournes had one of the building's finest units. Dark Island represented something different from these other properties. Indian Neck Hall was where the Bournes lived most of the year. The Dakota served as a city base for business and culture. Dark Island was pure recreation, a place removed from social obligations and business demands. The 7-acre island limited who could visit. Access required boats. The isolation was intentional. The castle's neighbor on nearby Inglenook Island was Frederick Remington, the famous painter and sculptor known for his depictions of the American West. Remington heard construction noise during the 3 years the Towers was being built. When it was completed, he sent a bouquet of flowers to welcome his new neighbors. The gesture established cordial relations between the 2 island properties. Bourne belonged to the New York Yacht Club, where he had served as Commodore since 1903. He owned multiple sailing vessels over the years and commissioned elaborate steam-powered boats. The Antique Boat Museum in Clayton would later acquire several vessels with Bourne provenance. He loved speed, fast boats, fast automobiles, rapid travel. In 1906, police arrested him for driving 25 miles per hour in his Mercedes through New York streets. The speed limit was lower. Bourne paid the fine without protest. The incident made newspapers because of his prominence. A man who could afford a Mercedes and a private island could certainly afford traffic citations. He was also a member of the Jekyll Island Club in Georgia, informally known as the Millionaires Club. The exclusive club occupied an entire barrier island off the Georgia coast. Members included J.P. Morgan, William Rockefeller, and William K. Vanderbilt. The club existed for winter recreation, hunting, fishing, social gatherings among America's wealthiest families. Bourne fit comfortably into those circles by 1905. The summers at Dark Island followed patterns common to wealthy families of that era. Adults entertained other wealthy visitors. Children played under supervision. Servants maintained the property and prepared meals. Boats transported everyone between island and mainland. The castle served as a base for hunting and fishing expeditions in the surrounding wilderness. The 7-acre island was indeed too small for hunting, but the Adirondack wilderness beyond offered abundant opportunities. Guides could be hired, expeditions organized. Game brought back to the castle for preparation and display. The mounted heads that would eventually decorate the drawing room came from such expeditions. Emma managed the household at Dark Island as she did at Indian Neck Hall and the Dakota. Staff hiring, menu planning, social coordination. The role of a wealthy woman in 1905 was management of domestic operations at scale. Emma oversaw multiple properties and the dozens of servants required to maintain them. The children grew up in this world of multiple estates, yacht clubs, and private islands. They understood wealth as normal. The secret passages at Dark Island were childhood playgrounds. The dungeon was an exciting place to explore with siblings. The castle was simply where the family spent summer weeks. Emma died in 1916. She was 61 years old. The cause of death was not recorded in surviving family documents. Howard, the youngest surviving son, died in 1918 at age 25. The specific circumstances are unclear from historical records. Some sources suggest illness. Others mention an accident. The family experienced the loss privately. Frederick Gilbert Bourne died on March 9, 1919 at Indian Neck Hall. He had been in declining health for months. He was 67 years old. The estate he left behind was valued at $43 million. The 7 surviving children could not agree on its distribution. Wealth at that scale created complex inheritance questions. Properties had to be divided, business interests allocated, personal effects distributed. On June 12, 1919, 3 months after their father's death, Dark Island and all its buildings were sold to Marjorie Bourne and her sister May Bourne, Strasburger, for $389,000. The sale resolved one piece of the inheritance dispute. The island would remain in the family, controlled by 2 of Frederick's daughters. The other children received other properties, business interests, and financial settlements. The exact division remains partially obscured by private family arrangements. Frederick Bourne had accumulated one of the great American fortunes. He had built the tallest building in the world. He had pioneered consumer credit. He had employed tens of thousands of workers across multiple continents. He had created a global manufacturing empire. He left behind children who had grown up assuming their father's wealth would continue indefinitely. They had never known factory floors or workers' strikes or 14-shilling weekly wages. They knew yachts and private islands and society dinners. The castle passed to the next generation. What they did with it would reveal how completely they had absorbed their father's values. Chapter 6. The Daughters' Dispute. On June 12, 1919, Dark Island and all its buildings sold for $389,000. The buyers were Marjorie Bourne and her sister May Bourne Strasburger. The sale price represented less than 1% of their father's total estate. The 7 surviving children had spent months negotiating. Frederick Bourne had died without leaving detailed instructions for dividing his properties. Indian Neck Hall, the 100-room mansion on Long Island, the Dakota apartment, Dark Island, various business interests and investments, real estate holdings, art collections, yacht club memberships, the accumulated material culture of decades of wealth. May Bourne had married Ralph Beaver Strasburger in 1913. Strasburger came from a wealthy Pennsylvania family. He had served as American Consul General to Romania, Bulgaria, and Serbia. The diplomatic posting gave him connections and prestige that complemented the Bourne fortune. Marjorie Bourne was 29 years old in 1919. She was unmarried. The inheritance gave her direct ownership of a significant property and the financial independence that came with it. In 1921, May granted Marjorie lifetime use of Dark Island. The legal arrangement meant Marjorie effectively controlled the property, while May retained partial ownership. The sisters had resolved their portion of the inheritance amicably. Marjorie married Alexander Dallas Thayer in December 1926. She was 36 years old. Thayer came from an established family. The marriage brought social benefits to both parties. In 1928, Marjorie made her first significant addition to the castle. She commissioned a squash court as a birthday present for her husband. The court was built on the north side of the island, a separate structure from the main castle. A sports therapy room was added nearby. A third-floor bedroom was constructed above the original piazza. The wooden piazza had to be converted to stone to support the additional weight. The renovation required careful engineering. The new stone construction had to match the existing granite work. Italian stonemasons were brought in again, as they had been during the original construction. The additions revealed Marjorie's approach to the property. She would preserve the core structure while modernizing and expanding based on family needs. The squash court served her husband's recreational interests. The therapy room addressed health concerns. The additional bedroom accommodated guests or family members. The clock mechanism had been installed in the tower in 1913 during her father's lifetime. The 4 6-foot clock faces and Westminster chimes had been his final addition. Marjorie maintained the mechanism carefully. The chimes continued sounding every 15 minutes across the water. During Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, Dark Island acquired certain rumors. The secret passages made the castle ideal for activities that required discretion. The proximity to the Canadian border, just yards away across the river, meant access to legal alcohol. Canadian liquor could be transported across the border and hidden within the castle's many passages. Whether the Thayers actually engaged in rum-running remains unconfirmed by documentary evidence. The rumors persisted for decades. The architectural features certainly would have supported such activities. The passages connected the boathouses to the main castle. Cargo could be unloaded and moved invisibly. The dungeon provided storage that few visitors would discover. The rumors added to the castle's mystique. The Castle of Mysteries gained another layer of legend. Secret passages, a dungeon, rum-running during Prohibition. Each story built on the previous ones. Marjorie and Alexander used the island the way Frederick and Emma had used it. Summer weeks, fall hunting trips, entertaining guests from their social circles, maintaining the property and its staff, preserving the furnishings and artwork that had accumulated during Frederick's ownership. The castle retained its original character. The suits of armor remained in the Great Hall. The massive marble fireplace was maintained. The library, with its hidden book-triggered panel, continued delighting guests who were shown the secret. The drawing room hosted dinners and gatherings. The bedrooms accommodated family and visitors. Marjorie proved to be a careful steward of her father's creation. She understood that the castle's value lay partly in its theatrical elements. She maintained the fantasy that Frederick had constructed. The medieval styling, the elaborate mechanisms, the sense of stepping into a different era and a different world. The years passed. The Thayers continued their summers at Dark Island. The castle aged gracefully. The granite held up well. The mechanical systems required maintenance, but remained functional. The isolation that had attracted Frederick still appealed to his daughter. By 1961, Marjorie was 71 years old. Alexander was 73. The castle required extensive upkeep. Staff had to be hired and managed. The island's remote location made routine maintenance complicated. Supplies had to be boated in. Repairs required workers to travel to the site. Winter ice sometimes damaged the boathouses and dock. The financial burden of maintaining Dark Island had become significant. The property generated no income. It existed purely for family use several weeks per year. The cost-benefit calculation no longer made sense. On December 27, 1961, Marjorie Thayer sold Dark Island to LaSalle Military Academy for less than $100. The sale price was remarkable. The property had sold for $389,000 in 1919. 42 years later, it sold for under $100. The massive depreciation reflected the changing economics of Gilded Age estates. What had once been valuable status symbols had become expensive liabilities. Wealthy families no longer wanted remote properties requiring year-round maintenance for seasonal use. LaSalle Military Academy owned Indian Neck Hall, Frederick Bourne's former Long Island estate. The school had converted the 100-room mansion into facilities for military education. The purchase of Dark Island came as part of a package arrangement. LaSalle acquired multiple Bourne properties in a single transaction. Marjorie died in 1962, less than a year after selling the island. She was 72 years old. She had owned Dark Island for 43 years. She had preserved her father's castle and added her own modifications. She had maintained the property through the Great Depression, World War II, and the massive social changes of the mid-20th century. Alexander Thayer outlived his wife by 6 years. He died in 1968 at age 80. He never returned to Dark Island after Marjorie's death. The castle had passed out of the Bourne family's control. The daughters who had negotiated its purchase in 1919 were gone. The island that Frederick had bought for recreation and status had become someone else's problem. LaSalle Military Academy had no particular use for a remote island in the St. Lawrence River. The property sat far from their Long Island campus. Transportation to the site was complicated. Maintenance costs were immediate and ongoing. The Academy had acquired Dark Island as part of a larger deal, not because they wanted it specifically. Within 4 years, they would sell it to someone who saw opportunity in the Castle of Mysteries. Chapter 7. The Evangelical Fraud. On April 17, 1965, LaSalle Military Academy sold Dark Island to the Harold Martin Evangelistic Association for $35,000. The buyer immediately renamed the castle Yorstadt. Dr. Harold George Martin had served as a chaplain in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He had founded the Harold Martin Evangelistic Association, a charitable religious organization incorporated in Quebec, Canada. Martin claimed Norwegian heritage through his grandfather. His family name had originally been Martin Jorstad before immigration to North America. The name change from the Towers to Yorstadt Castle reflected Martin's desire to claim the property as family heritage. The Norwegian connection, however distant, provided justification for renaming a Scottish baronial castle built by an American sewing machine executive. Martin stated publicly that Dark Island would serve as a retreat for ministers and missionaries. The Harold Martin Evangelistic Association described itself as interdenominational and international, composed of Baptist, Methodist, and Evangelical denominations. The organization operated Christian homes for children in Vaudreuil, Quebec. Martin presented the island acquisition as an expansion of that charitable mission. The breakfast room was converted into a chapel. Pews were installed. Religious artwork replaced the secular decorations. Martin announced that religious services would be held on the island every Sunday morning during the summer months, from May through October. These services would be open to all. Martin applied for tax-exempt status on the grounds that the property served religious and charitable purposes. The application was approved. Jorstadt Castle became tax-exempt property, despite being a medieval-styled mansion on a private island in the St. Lawrence River. The neighbors contested the tax exemption almost immediately. Property owners on surrounding islands and the nearby mainland argued that Martin was using the tax-exempt status to maintain a private summer residence at public expense. They pointed out that Martin and his wife Eloise lived at Jorstadt during the summer months. They occupied the castle's bedrooms. They used the facilities. They entertained guests in private quarters. The Sunday religious services, neighbors argued, were a pretext. The bare minimum required to maintain the appearance of religious use while enjoying a personal vacation property without paying property taxes. The dispute went to court. Martin defended the tax exemption by emphasizing the Sunday services. He and Eloise offered religious worship every Sunday morning, he testified. Anyone could attend. The chapel was open. The services were genuine expressions of faith, not performances designed to exploit tax law. The court ruled in Martin's favor. The judge determined that regular religious services open to the public satisfied the requirements for tax-exempt religious property. The fact that Martin also lived there during the summer did not negate the religious use. The neighbors had lost. Martin had secured legal protection for an arrangement that allowed him to live in a castle without paying property taxes. Over the 36 years that Martin controlled Yorstadt, the property deteriorated. The original Bourne Thayer furnishings were depleted through a combination of theft, sale, and simple removal. Valuable items disappeared. Some were sold to private collectors, others were taken by visitors or staff. The castle, that had been carefully maintained by Marjorie Thayer for 4 decades, lost much of its original character. Maintenance costs were substantial. A property of that size in that location required constant attention. Roofs needed repair. The granite walls needed repointing. The mechanical systems required updating. The boathouses suffered winter ice damage repeatedly. The dock needed rebuilding every few years. Martin allowed parts of the castle to fall into disrepair. Rooms were closed off. Systems failed and were not repaired. The deterioration was gradual but steady. The rumors about the castle intensified during this period. The secret passages took on darker significance. Stories about the dungeon became more elaborate. Visitors reported feeling uneasy. The combination of neglect, isolation, and architectural mystery created an atmosphere that fed speculation. The Castle of Mysteries became genuinely mysterious again. But the mystery was no longer Frederick Bourne's theatrical creation. It was decay and neglect masked by religious claims. In 1986, Martin put the property up for sale. The asking price was $5 million. The advertisement appeared in high-end real estate magazines. Unique Homes featured the listing. The property was marketed as suitable for a private residence, corporate retreat, or hunting lodge. Interest came from various quarters. Into the late 1980s and early 1990s, rumors circulated about potential buyers. Michael Jackson was reportedly interested. Donald Trump was mentioned. Wealthy Japanese investors allegedly toured the property. None of these sales materialized. The asking price fluctuated. It rose as high as $7 million. Then it dropped. The property remained on the market for years. The Harold Martin Evangelistic Association continued using Yorstadt for religious services and retreats. Martin and his family continued spending summers there. As Martin aged, his health declined. By the late 1990s, he and Eloise could no longer travel to the island regularly. Other members of the Evangelistic Association, particularly Harvey and Flo Jones, carried on the ministry. They led the Sunday services. They maintained what they could of the deteriorating property. Harold Martin died in November 1999. He was survived by his wife, a daughter, and 4 sons. The Harold Martin Evangelistic Association passed to his oldest son, Wycliffe Martin, who allowed the Sunday services to continue under Reverend Harvey Jones's leadership. The property remained on the market. The asking price had been reduced repeatedly. By 2001, the Evangelistic Association was willing to accept far less than the millions originally demanded. Martin had owned Yorstadt for 34 years. He had claimed religious exemption while using it as a summer home. He had depleted the furnishings. He had allowed the structure to deteriorate. He had proven that tax-exempt status could be maintained with minimal actual religious activity as long as the legal requirements were technically satisfied. The castle had survived Frederick Bourne's theatrical excess and Marjorie Thayer's careful stewardship. It had barely survived Harold Martin's neglect. Chapter 8. The Restoration. In 2001, American Castle Holdings acquired the property for $1.8 million. The actual purchaser was Dark Island Tours Incorporated, a company formed by Farhad Vladi and 2 American business partners. Vladi operated Vladi Private Islands, GmbH, a Hamburg-based real estate company specializing in selling private islands worldwide. The purchase price of $1.8 million was far below the asking prices of the late 1980s and early 1990s. The property had been on the market for 15 years. The Evangelistic Association needed to sell. The deterioration had reached a point where further delay would make restoration prohibitively expensive. Dark Island Tours began an extensive restoration campaign immediately. The goal was to stabilize the structure, preserve whatever original features remained, and update the safety and mechanical systems to allow public access. The restoration faced significant challenges. Decades of deferred maintenance had created problems throughout the castle. The roof leaked in multiple locations. Granite walls needed repointing. Windows required replacement. The electrical system was inadequate and potentially dangerous. The plumbing needed comprehensive updating. The boathouses required major repairs. The The generator that had powered the castle since 1905 had to be replaced with modern equipment. Despite the losses during the Martin era, most of the Bourne furnishings had survived. The suits of armor remained in the Great Hall. The massive marble fireplace was intact. The library still contained books from Frederick Bourne's collection. The drawing room retained its original character. The bedrooms held furniture that had been there for decades. The restoration team worked carefully to preserve these original elements while making the castle safe and functional for visitors. Secret passages were reinforced but left accessible. The dungeon was cleaned and secured. The clock tower mechanism was repaired. The Westminster chimes sounded again after years of silence. Dark Island Tours decided to rename the property once more. Jorstadt Castle became Singer Castle on Dark Island. The new name honored Frederick Bourne's role as president of the Singer Manufacturing Company. It also provided immediate brand recognition. Singer sewing machines remained familiar to the public even a century after Bourne's retirement. Tours were initiated in 2003, 2 years after the purchase. This marked the first time in the castle's nearly century-long history that the public could visit. Unlike Bolt Castle, which had been open to tourists decades earlier, Singer Castle had always been a private residence. The Bournes had used it, the Thayers had used it, Martin had lived there while conducting religious services. But ordinary people had never been allowed inside. The 45-minute guided tours took visitors through the main rooms. Tour guides explained the history of Frederick Bourne and the Singer Company. They demonstrated the hidden panel in the library. They showed the secret passages. They took visitors down to the dungeon. They explained the castle's architectural features and the flag design inspired by Sir Walter Scott's novel. The tours emphasized mystery and architectural marvels. The guides discussed the Bourne family summers and the castle's various owners. They explained how granite had been transported over ice. They told stories about Frederick Remington sending flowers to welcome his new neighbors. What the tours did not emphasize was labor history. The 1911 Singer strike went unmentioned. The conditions in Singer factories were not discussed. The workers who built the castle remained anonymous. The standard tour focused on wealth, architecture, and family anecdotes. In 2006, Dark Island was listed for sale through Sotheby's International Realty for $22 million. The listing described the property as a unique historic estate suitable for private ownership or continued operation as a tourist attraction. The restoration had been completed. The property was generating revenue from tours. The asking price reflected both historical significance and income potential. No buyers emerged at $22 million. The property was eventually removed from the market. Dark Island Tours continued operating the castle as a tourist attraction. Additional revenue streams were developed. The castle became available as a wedding venue. The drawing room and the outdoor spaces could accommodate ceremonies and receptions. The romantic setting appealed to couples seeking unusual locations. The secret passages and dungeon added atmosphere that ordinary venues could not match. Overnight accommodations were offered in the Royal Suite, a wing of the castle that could sleep up to 6 people. Guests could experience living in the castle for a night. The pricing was premium, reaching around $700 per night. The experience included meals prepared on-site and access to areas not included in standard tours. The castle attracted approximately 35,000 visitors per season. The season ran from May through October, matching the months when the Bourne family had originally used the property. The visitor numbers provided sustainable revenue. The castle was no longer a liability. It had become a functioning business. Singer Castle appeared in popular culture. The 2000 film The Skulls included scenes filmed at the castle during the Martin era. The Canadian folk rock band, Great Lake Swimmers, recorded part of their 2009 album, Lost Channels, at the castle. The album included an interlude consisting of 48 seconds of the castle bells chiming. These media appearances increased public awareness and drew additional visitors. Dark Island Tours had succeeded where multiple previous owners had failed. They had found a sustainable use for a property that had been too expensive for private owners to maintain and too specialized for institutional use. The combination of tours, weddings, and overnight stays generated enough revenue to cover maintenance costs and provide profit. The restoration preserved what remained of Frederick Bourne's theatrical vision. The secret passages still wound through the walls. The dungeon still waited below. The clock tower still chimed every 15 minutes. The suits of armor still stood guard. The castle still rose from Dark Island, looking like it had been transported from medieval Scotland. But the meaning had changed. What Frederick Bourne had built as a private monument to his own wealth had become a public attraction. Strangers walked through the rooms where Bourne's children had played. Tourists pulled the book that triggered the library panel. Wedding parties posed for photographs in the drawing room. The castle had been democratized through commerce. Anyone with $14.75 could enter spaces that had once been exclusively Bourne family territory. The transformation was complete. Singer Castle had become exactly what its architecture suggested it always was: a performance, a stage set, a carefully constructed illusion available to anyone willing to pay the admission price. Chapter 9. The workers who built it, the Italian stonemasons who carved the granite, came from Genoa. Their names were not recorded. The local workers who transported stone over ice and water left no written accounts. Approximately 116 workers labored on Dark Island during the construction period from 1903 to 1905. At the project's peak, around 100 masons worked simultaneously. The Italian craftsmen had been hired specifically for skills that local workers did not possess. These men had learned stone carving through apprenticeships that began in childhood. The techniques had been passed down through generations. They understood how to shape granite into elaborate decorative elements. They could carve griffins that appeared to leap from the stone. They created acanthus leaves with such detail that individual veins seemed visible. They fashioned fantastical creatures that gave the castle its theatrical character. The Italian stonemasons traveled from Genoa to a remote island in upstate New York. The journey crossed an ocean and most of a continent. They arrived at a construction site accessible only by water. They lived in temporary housing during the construction period. They carved stone in weather that ranged from summer heat to brutal winter cold. Their wages are not documented in surviving records. The contracts that brought them to Dark Island have not been preserved. Their names appear nowhere in the Bourne family papers or in contemporary newspaper accounts of the construction. The local workers quarried granite from Oak Island. They transported the stone by barge during summer months. In winter, they hauled tons of granite across the frozen St. Lawrence River. The work was dangerous. Ice thick enough to support loaded sledges could crack unexpectedly. The crossing had to be timed carefully, attempted only when conditions were optimal. Sandstone came from the quarry in Hammond. The material had to be moved to the water, loaded onto boats, transported to Dark Island, and unloaded. The process repeated hundreds of times as the castle rose from bedrock. The construction timeline overlapped with the Bolt Castle project on nearby Hart Island. When George Bolt halted construction in 1904 after his wife's death, workers on that project faced unemployment. Bourne's continuing work on Dark Island provided jobs for some of those displaced laborers. The economic relationship between the two castle projects saved workers from layoffs. One worker death occurred during construction. The details have been lost. Contemporary safety standards did not exist. Construction sites operated with minimal regulation. Accidents were common and poorly documented. A worker could fall, be crushed by stone, or suffer injury that led to infection and death. The specific circumstances of the Dark Island fatality are unknown. The worker's name was not preserved. No memorial marks the death. The castle stands as a testament to Frederick Bourne's vision and wealth. It does not acknowledge the man who died building it. The contrast between documentation of owners and workers reveals the system's priorities. Frederick Bourne's life is extensively documented. Birth records, business correspondence, newspaper articles, obituaries, estate records. Marjorie Thayer's ownership is thoroughly recorded in property transfers and family papers. Harold Martin's tax disputes generated court records. The workers who actually built the castle left no trace beyond the stones they carved. This erasure was not accidental. It reflected deliberate choices about whose stories deserved preservation. Wealthy men documented themselves extensively. They saved correspondence. They granted newspaper interviews. They commissioned biographies. Their estates generated legal records that archives preserved. Workers were not considered worth documenting. Their individual identities did not matter to the people who employed them. What mattered was the labor they provided and the wages they accepted. Once the work was complete, they disappeared from the historical record. The same pattern repeated across all of Bourne's enterprises. The Singer factories employed tens of thousands of workers across multiple continents. The 1911 Clydebank strike involved 11,000 workers, yet the individual strikers remain unnamed in most historical accounts. They appear as numbers and categories, not as people with specific identities and stories. The 12 women who sparked the strike by refusing additional unpaid work are not identified by name in surviving records. The women who earned 14 shillings per week fixing defects remain anonymous. The workers who earned 16 shillings per week polishing wood are statistical abstractions rather than documented individuals. Singer Company records preserved information about production numbers, sales figures, profit margins, and executive compensation. Worker names appeared only in payroll records that were eventually discarded as routine business documents with no archival value. The same logic applied at Dark Island. The castle's construction cost approximately $500,000. That figure was recorded and preserved. The amount paid to individual workers was not considered important enough to save. The Italian stonemasons returned to Italy when the work was finished. They carved granite on other projects. They trained apprentices who learned the same techniques. They lived lives that left no trace in American archives. Their contribution to Dark Island survives only in the stones they shaped. The local workers moved to other jobs. Some may have worked on other estates in the Thousand Islands. Others may have found employment in mills or factories. Their connection to Singer Castle ended when construction finished. The current tours mention Italian stonemasons as a category. Guides explain that skilled craftsmen were imported from Italy to create the elaborate carvings. The explanation acknowledges the workers' existence and skills. It does not name them or provide biographical details. The interpretive choice reflects continuing patterns. Architecture is attributed to named designers. Construction is attributed to anonymous workers. Ernest Flagg receives credit for designing Singer Castle. The men who actually built it receive generic acknowledgement. The granite remains. The carvings endure. Every carved stone carries the mark of hands whose names are lost. The griffins and acanthus leaves and fantastical creatures represent hundreds of hours of skilled labor by men who have been erased from the historical record. That erasure was the system working as designed. Capital documented itself. Labor disappeared. Frederick Bourne built a monument to himself. The workers built the monument. The monument remembers Bourne. The workers are forgotten. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Dark Island. Today, tourists arrive by boat. They pay $14.75 per adult, $7.75 for children 4 and older. Children under 4 enter free. The 45-minute tour begins in the Great Entrance Hall. The guide explains that Frederick Bourne was president of the Singer Sewing Machine Company. The guide describes how Bourne pioneered the installment plan that revolutionized consumer credit. The guide mentions that Ernest Flagg, architect of the Singer Building in New York, designed the castle based on Sir Walter Scott's novel Woodstock. The tour proceeds through the drawing room. The guide points out the original furnishings, the suits of armor, the massive marble fireplace, the medieval styling combined with modern conveniences. Electric lighting, modern plumbing, a generator that powered the entire island. In the library, the guide demonstrates the hidden panel. Pull the specific book. The mechanism triggers. The wall swings open to reveal a secret passage. Tourists photograph the moment. They marvel at the engineering. They ask questions about where the passages lead and why Bourne built them. The guide explains that the passages were built for entertainment, for mystery and theatrical effect. The explanation satisfies most visitors. Some ask about rum running during Prohibition. The guide acknowledges the rumors without confirming them. The tour descends to the dungeon. Tourists see the iron rings embedded in the stone walls. They ask if prisoners were ever held there. The guide explains that the dungeon was never used for imprisonment. It existed purely for atmosphere. The tour continues through bedrooms and bathrooms. The guide describes the Bourne family summers, the hunting and fishing expeditions, the neighbor Frederick Remington, who sent flowers when the castle was completed, the years when Marjorie Thayer owned the property and added the squash court for her husband's birthday. The tour mentions Harold Martin briefly. The property was owned by a religious organization for several decades. Martin renamed it Yorstadt Castle. Religious services were held. The current owners purchased the property in 2001 and restored it. What the tour does not mention requires listing. The 1911 Singer strike is not discussed. The 11,000 workers who walked off the job in Scotland do not appear in the standard narrative. The 12 women who sparked the strike by refusing additional unpaid work are not named because the tour guides do not know their names. The wages paid to Singer factory workers are not compared to Bourne's $43 million estate. The strike at the South Bend facility is not mentioned. The factory fire at Elizabethport receives no attention. The global pattern of labor exploitation that funded the castle is absent from the interpretation. The Italian stonemasons who carved the granite are mentioned as a category but not as individuals. The local workers who transported stone over ice are acknowledged generically. The worker who died during construction is unknown to the tour guides because no records documented his death. The Harold Martin tax dispute is not explained in detail. The neighbors who contested his tax-exempt status do not appear in the story. The decades of deterioration under Martin's ownership are mentioned briefly without examining how religious organizations can exploit charitable status. The tour emphasizes architectural marvels, family anecdotes, and the mystery of secret passages. It presents Frederick Bourne as a business genius who built a remarkable castle. It treats the castle as a triumph of vision and craftsmanship. The alternative interpretation is available in the stones themselves if tourists know how to read them. Every carved griffin represents hours of skilled labor by unnamed men. Every secret passage represents wealth extracted from workers who earned shillings. Every room represents the gap between those who owned and those who built. The gift shop sells Singer memorabilia, miniature sewing machines, postcards featuring the castle, books about the Thousand Islands and Gilded Age architecture. The merchandise celebrates the legacy that the tour presents. Singer Castle is not unique in its interpretive choices. Gilded Age estates across America follow similar patterns. The Vanderbilt mansions in Newport emphasize architecture and family history. The Rockefeller estates focus on conservation and philanthropy. The Carnegie properties highlight libraries and educational giving. The pattern is consistent. Celebrate the wealth, marvel at the architecture, acknowledge the philanthropy, minimize or erase the exploitation that made everything possible. Visitors who tour these properties receive a specific message. Wealth creates beauty. Vision builds monuments. Success deserves celebration. The costs are rarely mentioned. Dark Island represents a choice in historical preservation. The choice was made by Dark Island tours, by the tour guides they hired, by the interpretive materials they created. The choice was to tell the story that emphasizes wonder over exploitation. That choice was economically rational. Tourists pay to be impressed, not to feel complicit. Wedding parties want romance, not labor history. Overnight guests seek luxury, not lectures about wage theft. The business model requires maintaining the illusion that Frederick Bourne built, created through vision, rather than through the systematic exploitation of workers across 3 continents. The castle could be interpreted differently. Tours could begin with the 1911 strike. Guides could explain how women earning 14 shillings per week funded a $500,000 vacation house. The dungeon could illustrate the power dynamics between owners and workers. The secret passages could represent the hidden systems of exploitation that made Gilded Age wealth possible. Such interpretation would be accurate. It would be supported by historical evidence. It would provide visitors with a more complete understanding of the castle and the era it represents. It would also reduce ticket sales, wedding bookings, and overnight stays. The business model depends on maintaining the fantasy. Dark Island still sits in the St. Lawrence River. The clock tower still chimes every 15 minutes. The secret passages still wind through the walls. The dungeon still waits below. Tour guides still tell stories about Frederick Bourne's business genius and his family's summers. What they do not tell reveals as much as what they do. The castle was built on 2 fortunes. One came from sewing machines sold on credit to American families. The other came from workers who earned shillings while their employer earned millions. The first fortune is celebrated in every tour. The second is invisible. That invisibility is not an accident. It is a choice. Historic preservation always makes choices about which history to preserve. Dark Island chose to preserve the castle. It chose to forget the workers who built it. The granite remembers what the tours do not. Every carved stone carries the mark of hands whose names we will never know. That is the real dark story of Dark Island. Not the shadows cast by evergreen trees. the shadows cast by wealth that erases its own origins.